Good morning, sisters. How are you? Good morning to you all. So excited that we're here again in this space. We would like to welcome to each one of you. We're so happy to see you, Jessie, and all the different sisters that are connected, that are online today. Sometimes technology is a little complex when we're using it. Sometimes because our internet is failing. Sometimes it's hard to find this time and this space, but we are very happy that we are able to be here in this space again. And we're going to leave some time for our invocation. Yes, that is ready. And she will be sharing with all of us this space that's so important. And Esther, the time is yours. Go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon from Kenya. I am Esther, and what I had in mind was a lullaby, a Maasai lullaby song that is so common in my community that my mother used to sing to me, and I also sang to my son. So it's very special to me. It's a lullaby song. It's a love song between a mother and a baby and her babies. In the song, the mother is telling the baby that it's a big sister telling the baby that mother has gone for a short distance, but she will come back, and still telling the baby a lot of love, nice things. And the mother also can use the song just also to tell a lot, especially when the baby wants to sleep, and telling the baby a lot of nice things. So here we go. Tigiraiye nananai, oh yeah, oh. Tigiraiye nananai, oh yeah, oh. Aina dara nanana, oh yeah, oh. Aina dara nananai, oh yeah, oh. Kinyorengai nanana, oh yeah, oh. Kinyorengai nananai, oh yeah, oh. Esamong tunying kadoru, oh yeah, oh. Esamong tunying kadoru, oh yeah, oh. Tigiraiye nanana, oh yeah, oh. Tigiraiye nananai, oh yeah, oh. Esamong tunying kadoru, oh yeah, oh. Keshugunyage ngudunyi, oh yeah, oh. Tigiraiye nanana, oh yeah, oh. Kinyarangai nananai, oh yeah, oh. Ngaina tara nanana, oh yeah, oh. Ngaina tara sembewet, oh yeah, oh. Tigiraiye nananai, oh yeah, oh. Tigiraiye nananai, oh yeah, oh. Kinyarangu tunyi nanana, oh yeah, oh. Kinyarangu tunyi nananai, oh yeah, oh. Tigiraiye nanana, oh yeah, oh. Tigiraiye nananai, oh yeah, oh. Kinyarangu nanana, oh yeah, oh. Kinyarangu nananai, oh yeah, oh. Tigiraiye ngarayai, oh yeah, oh. Tigiraiye nananai, oh yeah, oh. Tigiraiye nananai, oh yeah, oh. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Esther. Thank you for sharing with us this beautiful melody to open our session. It definitely
You're
takes us
welcome.
to a different space
You're welcome.
where sometimes we can remember that childhood, like we were saying at the beginning. It's a melody for them, for the babies. Thank you for sharing this as part of this opening that we always have before we start this process, this formative process. And we're going to start. I would like to ask you that we can start our cameras, that we can turn on our cameras for this exercise that we're going to do right now. And I will ask you some elements, a little bit so that we can wake up, that we can be in this space. And I will ask you for some objects that you're going to present before the camera. And that's why I ask you to please turn on your cameras. I understand that sometimes the signal is a little complicated, but if we could please turn on our cameras, that would be much better. Okay, so we are going to start. I would like for you to show me in the camera a pen that you have close, any color, a pen that you might have close to you. So go get the pen. Oh, that's perfect. Okay. A pen, a pencil. Good. Some of you are looking, where do I have a pen? Very good. Very good. Thank you. Now, I would like to ask you to show me on camera any kind of body lotion, some lotion, yes, that you might have close to you. Okay, a lotion. Good, good. Oh, some of you are running to go look for it. Okay, good job, good job. Good job, Esther. Good job.
Sunblock.
Thank you. Now we are going to show on camera maybe some glasses that you have, whether it's seeing or just sunglasses. Do you guys have any glasses close to you that you can show on camera? Good, good, very good. Perfect. Okay. Well, we are going to present or show on camera maybe an earring. Do you use earrings? Good job, Esther. Earrings? Do you guys have earrings that you can show on camera? Not all of you use earrings, correct. Okay. Good job. Well, now I'm going to ask Jessie if she can continue with this dynamic, requesting any object. Good morning to you all, sisters. I
Good
think
morning.
I can.
Hi.
Can you guys show me a notebook? A notebook where you take notes, maybe? I think we all have a notebook. If you have maybe some accessory, some hair accessory, a brooch or something like that for your hair, if you wear them,
Mine is too short.
a bracelet maybe. Do you guys have a bracelet that you can show on camera? Most of us have some, right? Or does maybe somebody have something that they're somebody, maybe you have somebody with you there? Here I have my
Ah,
daughter with me. So maybe show somebody that's with you right now.
this
Have a wonderful day or afternoon. Thank you.
this my home manager. Good evening.
Wonderful. Wonderful to know that we can have other generations that are there close to us,
Yeah.
bringing us their energy and that support. Okay, well, we are going to continue with our presentation of today. Does anybody remember what we were sharing in the last session? Words, phrases, something that maybe resonates and that you feel it's important to share here?
I would love to share. In previous session, we are talking about Cedaw and their articles, and I feel like that the whole article is written for general women and not for Indigenous women. As an Indigenous woman, we are faced more discrimination than general women. Like in our life, we are facing discrimination because we are poor. We are living in remote place. Even we are discrimination face discrimination because of Indigenous, and we also face discrimination as a woman, and we are also face discrimination as a Indigenous woman in different way. So I feel like that article talk about only for general women, not any specific article are talk about Indigenous women. In my country, it's conflicted Article 2 and also our Constitution. Constitution gives the right to religious and other person or family customs to uh, to do what to religious have some uh, process or the rituals which is discriminated women, which is also supported by our Constitution. But in Cedaw, we Article 2, it's talk about the how a state and laws are uh, laws are less or cancel those law or constitutions, any article which is discriminated women. I feel like that if a state is not doing or working for Cedaw, then in Bangladesh they are signed in 1984. Cedaw, but still we are facing discrimination, racism, even they don't give us equal right. So I feel like that Cedaw need to reform their article, and definitely UN are not pressure to any country. So that's why I need to reform Cedaw for this article. For as an Indigenous woman, we need to work on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanja. Yes, it's very important, this reflection, because it doesn't exist within this convention of the Cedaw, something that will mention the particularity that are women, these differences that we could have, but that it's also important that we could read it. We could read the Cedaw and take it with time so that we can maybe analyze each of the articles so that we know if there is a need for us, or maybe other articles can be more representative of our context. We also were mentioning in the last session of how it was so important to have reached the Cedaw, since we had a lot of aspects that we couldn't consider. And most of these 9 conventions or most important treaties of the United Nations don't speak specifically about Black or Indigenous women, which are the ones that are part of this social group that are the most discriminated, or even with certain limitations. That's why we saw the intersectionality, sorry, of violence, general violence, and how this affects some women more than others. However, we also know that these treaties are very general and that we need to bring them to our country. And when we do that, when we try to apply it in our country, we probably need something else or something different, or even something more specific according to what we are living. But it is precisely the same way of what we're going to see in today's session, how we can solve these spaces or these empty spaces that the Cedaw presents. So thank you for bringing on sharing with us these reflections that are so important to our process. Does anybody else want to share with us what we were talking about, your main impressions of what we have spoken about up to date? I would like to say something as well. I remember that we also did this comparative chart between the Cedaw and the Convention 169 of the OIT, and maybe it's a little bit more general. Article 169, Convention 169, it's more general for the Indigenous communities, and the Cedaw is specifically for women. But we were also talking about how they are similar in some articles for each of the documents, and that they were also complementary. They complement themselves. For example, Convention 169, we were checking the articles that we had to check. They spoke in our group. They talked a lot about having territory or having land, access to land. So these are documents or conventions that complement each other. Thank you, Jesse, for bringing forth this reflection about how we can continue knowing more about the instruments of which a lot of these are reinforced, or even a lot of these articles, maybe what they do in another convention or in another treaty, is that they broaden even more the concept that you are discussing. So that's why it's so important that when we do that defense of our individual or collective rights, we bring forth different instruments or international conventions to be able to do that. Sometimes we can always find these of empty spaces or these um, within the international conventions, and for the indigenous communities, we have we have a Convention 169, which was also created with a vision of indigenous communities. I would like to share with you that experience that we had with some sisters from Guatemala, of how we were, when we were reading the Cedaw, and we realized that indigenous women were not represented. And we thought, no, we have to broaden this vision. We have to make sure that discrimination and racism that we live is considered as an act of violence against us. And we started to do some lobbying, which we're going to present next week in detail. And they were telling us, no, why do you want to have another convention, another legislative instrument, if you already have Convention 169 that speaks directly of indigenous women? Why do you want to bring it into the Cedaw? But we said that it was important for us because we saw that the Cedaw speaks directly about women in comparison to Convention 169 that would include all the population, women, men, which is fine, but we needed to talk about women and their experience, because it's not the same as an indigenous man is not the same as an indigenous woman. The experience of violence, of racism, of discrimination are completely different. So on that part, we wanted to braid or to link together everything that has been built to defend our rights. We are going to listen to another sister. Please, if anybody wants to share with us that you have been reflecting on, that is valid based on what we're living. Nukila, you want to share with us?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think I hope there is no disturbance during my my speaking like this. My reflection regarding the Cedaw and the Convention 169, right? A convention, or I don't know if the other areas in Africa, in America Latin, but in Asia, mostly the indigenous people have not been recognized as indigenous. They because they consider just like a with the terminology like customary people, or like a traditional people. So for the term like indigenous people is is quite resistant for the government to recognize these indigenous people. This the challenge that we are facing as indigenous people, mostly for us the indigenous women. So it's about self-identification and recognition from the state have not been discussed widely. How to solve this problem, because we have to show our solidarity, right? From based on the region, Africa, America, Asia. I think that's the challenge, yeah. The challenge, how we are being recognized as indigenous people. We have our own indigenous knowledge, indigenous wisdom, but in fact, it's very difficult, yeah. Particularly when you want to get during the pandemic COVID-19, we have difficulty to get like a social safety net. We cannot say we are from the indigenous group. So we are from the local community. If we say we are from the local community, is quite easy for us to get, for instance, social safety nets during the pandemic COVID-19. I think that's the challenge, yeah, regarding the recognition and also self-identification. Not to mention the issues regarding the challenge from the women, indigenous women, because particularly about the language in United Nations is only recognized 5 languages, right? 5 Mandarin, China, French, Spanish, English. Well, we have our own indigenous language. So how we've been, our indigenous language been recognized as well. Some of the indigenous people cannot attend to the UN forum because they don't have representation. They don't know how to speak English. And I think this is the challenge as well. How can they speak up about their condition, situation in their village, in the remote areas? Because they don't have a chance to learn about English or other UN language. I think that's my second reflection regarding why our indigenous people in Asia particularly will become marginalized because some of us, we don't speak English at all. And it's a challenge for us because we don't speak furthermore, we cannot speak French, Spanish, and other language. So that's my second reflection. My third reflection regarding Cedaw. Those who discuss about indigenous people, they are not from the indigenous group. They're from the NGO. How can we say they represent the indigenous women? They're not from the indigenous group. They're from the NGO. And they represent us to the international forum. That's not fair for the indigenous women as well. How can they know about this? I know, how can we not discuss about this as well? And then we don't know how to, for instance, like them, they're really well trained. Many training regarding, like a UN mechanism and other issues. But for the indigenous women, we don't have the capacity to do that. That's, I think, my reflection, even though we have very high language in Cedaw, but in reality, it's quite difficult, because they are become most marginalized, particularly indigenous women. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nukila. Actually, yes, we live with a lot of limitations of recognition. And not only that recognition that many states or governments make, that we add to another statistic, but also well, we also have to understand how that recognition needs to start from that wisdom, from that ancestral knowledge, from that respect to our spirituality, to our language, that respect to our own ways of life, right? And we see that this happens in several territories. It's something that we live a lot in Latin America. In fact, it's a problem, a world problem, unfortunately. What is commented on that only 90 countries recognize that there are originary peoples or indigenous. However, we don't have a specific statistic that can really tell us how many millions or billions we are on Earth. There are no statistics that talk about this. And that's a great difficulty because when we are not recognized, not even in numbers, it's very difficult to respond to our needs in particular. In fact, the Cedaw was one of the purpose of the women who built it. And there's a general recommendation, and with the recommendations, what they do is to broaden this vision of the. And women talk about how it's important to generate statistics from women, to generate statistics that allow us to know how many indigenous women we are. But not only that, but with what response governments can provide for them. So socially, we are facing that small or no recognition that indigenous communities live or originary peoples live. there's also debates of how we identify ourselves. Sometimes we can call each other indigenous peoples or originary peoples, even some women, some Black women that are indigenous women, but at the same time they're Black women. How or what kind of how do we identify ourselves? Or even some women in Guatemala, we were talking about that there are Black women who identify themselves as indigenous women, but others identify, for example, as Creole women, which is another culture, but they don't identify as indigenous women. So women also represent a whole challenge due to our differences and the way that we want to identify. We are over on that exercise as well of how we can continue providing evidence on those differences. Thank you so much for sharing this part. We also would like to tell you that some women are like very linked to the earth, and that's something that happens very much in Latin America. However, in other continents, maybe the link to the earth might happen in a different way because a lot of them are on ice. Sometimes the ice is melting or it's changing structure, and sometimes women or originary peoples have to migrate towards other spaces. And hence the link to the earth is completely different in comparison to Latin America, that is very strong because we defend it, we try to mainly be in our territory, to conserve what we have, and it's completely different than other continents. So yes, women, we are diverse, and hence we try to comply with all these expectations that we have for the rights of women. It becomes a challenge. However, nothing is impossible, but instead we can propose other ways of how we can make visible these rights that are independent from the ways of how we live. So thank you so much for these reflections. They always fill us with a lot of knowledge, and it brings a lot more topics to the table that we can discuss, and we can continue with these reflections that give us more motivation with this. And it's what we were commenting, what happens with these rights that are not specifically within this convention, and how we are going to solve these empty spaces or these voids within the convention and find routes to be able to talk about these voids. And these voids that we see within the Cedaw, which are many, because we barely talk about 11 articles within the Cedaw that talk about these rights and obligation of the state. However, there are many other topics or violations to our rights that are not discussed on here. However, article number 1, which we also saw in the previous session, of how we were dosifying this, and it was talking about substantial equality or substantive equality and discrimination, and how where it happens, and how we can start filling these voids. We also have articles 23 and 24 that talk to us about broadening these articles and how we can provide how we can create some substance for the Cedaw with other conventions or legislative bodies, and especially Article 19, which I didn't write on the slide, that talks to us about the general recommendations of how these could be, or these three aspects could help us to solve that which is left out of the Cedaw. And the sisters who were proposing the Cedaw at some point, which was in their in the 70s or 60s or 70s, they were talking about how they couldn't include everything in this Cedaw, even terms that they would have liked to have left very well explained. However, that needed to be negotiated. And a lot of that was not included. However, they were visionaries and they realized that they needed to make this useful even to date, to our day and age. And we're going to just have a summary of the main of what was presented in the Cedaw, the main ideas of the Cedaw. And it talks about how it broadens state responsibilities, and it gives us some parameters of how states need to comply with establishing appropriate measures to eliminate discrimination towards women. Also, we have to see how the states are forced or should promote adopting different measures to prevent discrimination against women, and they can do this through public policies, internal laws, and how they can carry out special measures. And when we talk about special measures, and when we talk about Articles 1 to 16, and that means that you can create many mechanisms that help certain sectors of women that still have the challenge to reach equality. We were talking about how we can promote scholarships and invite certain percentage of Indigenous women to participate, or say certain percentage is for Black women, certain percentage of the scholarships are for Indigenous girls or Indigenous women or Black women. So these are special measures that governments need to take into consideration and apply. But there are some measures at the time of looking for a job. They say, for example, that it's, preferably Indigenous woman, or preferably a woman that speaks an originary language. So are the measures that that the governments can adopt, governments in power can adopt to reach equality. So this is something, or these affirmative measures or temporary measures are also very important. For example, during the COVID emergency, which was something that we all faced, we talked about, for example, the importance of how we can respect ways and practice and the different healing practices from the originary people. These temporary measures allow that to create emphasis on what's going on what's happening, and how there's a response before any situation. And these measures, these special measures, should be always reinforced or reformulated so that women can have always this kind of reach this equality that we need. So also the Cedaw, what we were talking about is that it can give us a definition on what is discrimination And it talks to us about how this discrimination is recognized or recognizes that substantive measures, and it could provide different ways to identify discrimination, and we have to be very watchful and mindful of what's happening in our territories and in our countries in order to be able to identify when we are in before a case of discrimination, when we are being subjected to discrimination. And sometimes this could be very subtle, or something that derives to discrimination, even if the original objective may be different, but we can react before this that can be created, and it could be considered discriminatory, and that is a result of these actions. It also obligates states to recognize, protect, and guarantee all the rights of women. A lot of this, we believe, could continue being a very strong challenge, because a lot of the states have adopted, out of 189, out of hundreds, 89 have adopted these different instruments. But if they protected and guaranteed the rights of women, women would not be where we are now. So we also believe that a lot of what is established in all these conventions are just parameters, or it's the ideals to be able to guarantee or have guarantees of the rights of women, but this is not necessarily complied with. But I also think that there is a need for us to elevate or to make our voices heard, to raise our voices so that they're heard, and to have this be complied with, so that we don't stay in that comfort zone that in a lot of situations we have adopted before, the situations that women live. But it's also important to raise our voices from our communities and from our needs, from our ways of thinking, so that we can have this be a reality, okay? So here we finish with like the Cedaw. There's a lot to talk about in regards to the Cedaw. And we are going to go to teamwork right now to reflect a little bit. So we can discuss what we're talking about. So the idea is that we have certain analysis from our realities, a little bit, because this is the ideal of what we're talking about. And everything that we have analyzed on the Cedaw, we know that this is like the maximum part of we could have, and that we should have this be the norm, but we still have some we have to face a lot of challenges, and we're going to go to these group reflections, and we're going to answer these questions. In the region where I live, oh, I don't know what I did, sorry. In the region where you live, has Cedaw been used to defend the women of rights? Have you heard of cases where Cedaw was used to really defend these rights? And if it has been used, the idea is that we can share it. And you can share it in the groups that we're going to break out in. The other question is, how can Cedaw be used in your country? Do you think that there could be alternatives to use or to apply this convention in your country? Do you think it can be adapted? How do you see this? And the third question is, what are your impressions on the Cedaw? What do you think? What do you think around this convention within this space that we have been discussing, so that we can analyze it as a group? We're going to have 15 minutes so we can talk about these questions. And we're going to share when we come back with the main group what we have been talking about, so that we can all benefit from this knowledge and identify what are these particularities that women live from the diverse continents, Asia, Africa, Latin America. And so we can talk about the realities of women in your area, in your region, and see how the Cedaw has been adapted to our needs. So I'm going to ask Dunan so they can share or divide the groups. Okay, and we can answer the questions.
Ahora sí, perfecto. Muchas gracias.
So, well,
So, I know
did
you
you
were lacking
guys
time.
have
The talks are very
did you guys had any issues? Did you have were you able to answer all 3 questions in your groups? Can you all hear us?
Can everybody
Okay.
listen?
Okay. We're going to go with the first group that can share the reflections that you made with each continent.
The space is yours, so whenever you want to participate, we would like to start. Samai is going to start. I will tell you a bit about what we were talking about with Jeneline, Jesse. On the first question, on the region where we live, where was it that was? We started looking at what happened in our countries and regions. So that was, if it's that I was being present. In Colombia, it is. Jeneline was mentioning that this is the first time that she actually listens about Cedaw. But Colombia is ratified, and that is important to work in the terms of discrimination for women. And Jesse also mentions she listed more about the C-169 convention, but this course has allowed her to search more about the topic on Cedaw. Liz mentions that in the 80s in her country it was ratified, but with the constitutional changes, it's very little support has been given to it. But also now with the fight of the towns, we see certain norms that ensure the rights of women to be defended and for women to have a voice. In terms of Ecuador, I was mentioning that I need a bit more. I need a bit more about Cedaw because I've worked with organizations that work with women, and they were also women activists, so and women in rural areas in the Ecuadorian. So I was very in the know of what was happening or the work that was being done. There, I was able to see how lawyers were used in this conventions in the reports and take them to the court. We also, I heard about cases in which femicide, this was used a lot to defend and bring this information up to the court. So I knew a bit more about this, about Cedaw. And also for the laws to prevent and violence against gender that are based on the organization that I'm working here to instruct women on this law and the prevention of eradication against women's. So there, you got to continue working on this as well. What's happening with the women and their bodies. For the second question, just to summarize it a bit more, how to use it out in our countries. We were all in agreement that it's important to understand it and to know it all, to review it again, to be actually take ownership of the document. Our country, it could be signed and ratified, but there is no link in which we know about it. So ourselves, our communities to know about it. So it is important, we feel, that everyone is aware of it. And for the last question, we were impressed about it, especially the topic on discrimination and how it takes a hit on our condition as women. And also it is important to understand that Cedaw has a big impact. Jesse was mentioning that it's a very big instrument that talks towards women, but we're still lacking something to bring into our communities. It is necessary to put it into our context. So bring it to our territories. We can talk about Cedaw, but in the communities, we need to be able to talk about equality of women and men. So the way that we speak of it and talk about it in our communities will allow it to take more ownership. That's what we can talk about right now. And I think it's something that is very important. How this rights, how we are the instruments to bring this rights to our communities and talk about it with our indigenous justice, because it is important in each of our countries. And our peers who talk about violence, who are victim of violence, they said that nobody was looking after them. So having that indigenous justice is allows us to understand better, know our own, we know our own languages. So it would be nice to talk about it within those contexts as well. Thank you for the reflection. It called my attention, that last part that you were sharing, and the whole thing was important, but the last part you were sharing was good. So I'm talking about our languages, talking about putting into our context, to be able to actually reach better impact. And something that we started in our first session was about that good living, and that also is related to how to reach that equality. Sometimes it is something to have it built to a national level and then bring it to our territories. It's a whole challenge on its own, especially from the whole system of justice in our countries and how we put them in our, make them friendly to ourselves, especially for indigenous people. We have our own justice systems, and to be able to reflect on it, a bit about this, that some of our peers here have mentioned from other organizations, that this system can also be a system that is built within our own context, because we have other reflections that we can take into account, from our experience, to reaffirm what we have in our own towns, and to continue debating and including women and the rights of women in these spaces, so that we can really have that equality that we're fighting for. So we need more spaces of dialogue, of debating, of analysis, for women to continue strengthening these rights. Thank you for that space. We continue with the other groups, please. Asia or Africa, I don't know who wants to start sharing.
Thank you so much, from the group of Asia. We have the very good it was very good discussion regarding the Cedaw, and I can read what our discussion. All of the other countries in Asia, they already ratified the Cedaw, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, in the national laws. Mostly on the national laws, this convention already legislated towards the national regulation, as a human rights standard, the norms and obligations, as well as the state responsibilities. And ASEAN countries have also the responsible agencies to implement the Cedaw. As I can highlight about who are the responsible agencies in Cedaw. They are Ministry of Women and Ministry of Women and Child Protection, for instance. There are Social Welfare Government, National Commission on Women, or National Human Rights, National Commission on Women Rights, and then the group of NGO, group of women who are responsible to implement the CEDAWs because of the laws. And then during the discussion, we found that the issues that tackling on the CEDAW is rather narrow. For instance, issue of education, issue of violence against women, domestic violence, women abuse, and then lack of political participation of women. While in fact, there are many complexity of the women issues. For instance, the issue of the women in trafficking, earlier marriage, many issues regarding the complexity of the women. And then we found that the platform towards these responsible governments and National Human Rights Commission and a group of NGOs are rather weak, because some of them do not really engage with the women in the remote areas, Indigenous women, and because of that, there is a lack of participation of the women. And then also most of the issues of women is also taken care by the men. So without the participation of the women, that's my understanding. So we consider that the Cedaw is the biggest, the good platform, good mechanism of women rights, because we can align with the Cedaw. This already in our national laws. We can contribute on the Cedaw, and this is the could be like a platform for socialization and awareness about the women rights, and also the platform for consultation, collaboration, coordination, and also to give recommendation to the governments. So during this consultation, we also discuss about that it needs there is a CEDAW, but the lack of the implementation. So this and then implementation of the recommendation of the CEDAW, a general recommendation. So we highlight that it needs more government responsibility to implement the recommendation of the CEDAW, and then to actively engage, not only for the government should invite Indigenous women to taking part of the consultation of the CEDAW reporting, for instance, because it we are as our understanding in the group that discussion mostly dominant by the NGOs, while some friends doing the work, they engage with the local community, the Indigenous community, and they taking their needs and what kind of the issues that they want to raise to the CEDAW for the CEDAW issues. And then the other issues that, oh yeah, I forget to tell you that beside the issues of the lack of issue of trafficking, child marriage, femicides, there is also the issue of the criminal justice system that never been discussed. Yeah, a lack of discussion regarding this. What kind of the what kind of the regulation that we need to tackle the issue of, for instance, women in trafficking. What kind of the policy that we should be could be the answer for the issue of the, for instance, the earlier child marriage, and then how to make sure that who are how to make sure that everyone is involved on the discussion of the Cedaw. So the government, our recommendation for from the group, but the government is the responsible one, the duty bearers of the Cedaw. So they have the responsibility to implement, to engage, to do consultation, to initiate the discussion, to invite everyone, including indigenous women, uh, to taken seriously the recommendation of the Cedaw, and then also how to make it more implemented in the field, yeah, for the government agencies. I think that I want to conclude from the Asia group. Thank you so much.
For that internal discussion that you had, especially because of that, the the question that we have regarding on last session about the countries we're using human trafficking, and how within those continents we can all be participating on these terms. That even if the documents are ratified, Mukila, as here mentions, certain things about these governments or in the states that are part of making this dynamic to change the reality. I think that it's also very important to talk about how this document can be supported with the human rights of the indigenous women, but also there's also particularity in this topic, because of the differences that we have. So how do we take that into consideration? In this continent, Asia, you also mentioned, we talked about a few years back, how at some point how can we get closer to the different instruments, and that is still a challenge. And we were talking about how women were organized, but they were still missing that representation in spaces, international spaces, like United Nations. And still, in those years that we made that reflection, there's very little representation in that area. So how do we take that in that space, the activities to make this impact, and to make this a reality for this rights to be recognized? So there's a lot that you can talk about in the spaces, and to actually be heard on what's happening. I don't want to say that and romanticize it, because United Nations it's the best thing, but how can we use it as a platform to create those spaces and opportunities to face the state, and how we can use this platform to ensure those rights, which until the moment it's been the only platform, international platform, who has a big backup that talks about the human rights, and that's what we have, and that's what we can use of this tool. This is a tool that we have at our disposal. We're gonna leave another space for the last group. This is Africa. So Africa, please.
Okay. So Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, Esther, go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. So in the African group, we discussed several articles, Cedaw articles. So just allow me to, it's not possible to mention all of them, but in Kenya, the government initiated legislative, administrative, and judicial measures in curbing discrimination against women across three main fields: the socio-cultural, the political, and the economic sphere. This paper was drafted in Kenya. It was called a gender policy framework. It was drafted in 2011 to enhance women's status at the three government levels. So I'll talk about them briefly. So the first one I'll talk about is Article 15 of equality of men and women before the law. Cedaw Article 15, which is equality of men and women before the law. And this article is talking a lot about a lot of things, but all in all, it is saying that women have equal representation in the courts of law, and the Constitution of Kenya is to take care of all the sexes, the men and women, and the family. They form the family law. They form the something to the legal act to take care of businesses and family. So whichever way the women were to be equally represented the same measure with men. So that was Article 15, which said equality of men and women before the law. And then Article 14 was to address the situation of rural women, like where I am. Remember in the previous discussion, we talked about high poverty levels in the community, and sometimes that's what compromises even the rights of women. So the government, under this Article 14, Cedaw Article 14, was to address the situation of rural women, and this is how it addressed. One, it stimulated rural economics through legislation. And the government passed what we call the Land Act. And you remember even last on Tuesday, I also talked about the Land Act. So the government, through legislation, passed through the Land Act, which states in paper that women have equal rights. Women have equal land rights as women, as men. It also covered other things like agriculture and livestock. Like I am a pastoralist, so the government came up with measures to boost the socioeconomic of pastoralist women. One of them is a very famous socioeconomic in Kenya. We call it table banking and the situation of rural women. So this table banking is where women come together, they put their little money together, and they share and they save. So the government has recognized that these small financial steps are a ladder to big economic freedom. So the government has come up with one. We have now a bank that specifically addresses women issues. It's called Kenya Women Trust Fund. It gives loans to women. It gives manageable loans to women. So that's one economic situation to address rural women like myself. And then Article 13 was to measure for elimination of discrimination against women in other areas of social economic life. You remember that we also talked about the political in Kenya, and it states the Kenya Act law says that women have a right to freedom to vote. Women have a right to get any possession in the country. Women have a right to represent the government of Kenya internationally. So this article was able to take care of all that under several legislation. It is an act of 2013 that takes care of all those things, all those places, political situations that positions that women can have, can occupy. It's a lot of things we discussed anyway. Allow me just to mention that the government of Kenya addressed these issues. One, it addressed gender-based violence. It also addressed female genital mutilation and the elimination of all forms of discrimination and violence against women. In addressing economic sustenance and economic freedom, the government of Kenya constituted a women enterprise fund just to focus on the economic situation of rural women. It also formed a branch of parliament that is called Kenya Women Parliamentary Association. The Kenya Women Parliamentary Association is an association of all women parliamentarians, and they specifically address women issues and present them in parliament. It also talks about, there's an article that talks about persons with disabilities and what preference are given on women and vulnerable people. It also, several articles also talks about sexual offenses act, and how it protects women. All in all, because I'm in a very windy place, I hope you guys can get me. All in all, what we discussed is that some parts of the Cedaw Convention have been addressed in paper. It is so good. It is put in the Constitution. It is clearly in the Constitution about the women's rights, about education, about the socio-economic plans. All these things are very well put in the Constitution. My only concern now is how are those conventions, how are those articles translate to reality, to the rural women like where I am now? How many women around here know that we have a right? They have a right to be represented in a court of law for free. How many women know that nobody has a right to mutilate their body? So those conventions, it's true the government has adopted it, but now my concern is the gap between the convention, the articles is here, and the woman is here. That space, there's a huge space between the reality. So my impression is there is still so much to be done. There's still so much to be done in the villages. There's still so much to be done with the indigenous women to bring these articles into reality, so that it's intrinsic, that these women know their rights, that these women can experience their freedom. So that is what I have written in my notebook here, but any member of the group can add. I know Fatima said something about, I don't know which country, Fatima, where did you come from? Somebody else talked about trafficking, child trafficking is so high in their country, and people fear taking children to school because of the high trafficking. Yeah, Kenya has also, there's an article also Kenya had addressed about human trafficking and prostitution. So as I said, all these things are good in paper, but in reality, it is something else. So I welcome any group member to add anything that I may have forgotten. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther, for this reflection. How much progress has been made from Africa to provide and facilitate these opportunities for women to ensure certain rights. There's still a lot of work to do. How we can make it more dynamic, all this instrument. We know there is a number of instruments, of conventions, of articles, treaties. We have international get-togethers where you have communications of what to be done. But just as you mentioned, Esther, there's still a lot of things that's still on paper and not taken to action. So the actions are still lacking. And we still need to see them to put that in favor of the population. The topic of human trafficking as well, and the mutilation that you've been mentioning in this space. And it's still that we still don't have a response on that topic as well in relation to the existence of instruments that talk about this and public policies that can discuss it and begin reducing these situations, especially women and children and girls. And so that we get, so that part of the work where women need to know about these instruments to make this a reality. We're gonna have the break right now. Thank you for the break. We're gonna have a little break. Thank you for the reflections that we've had today by other groups. And we're gonna come back at 9 o'clock for this space to continue with this, going more in depth with the reflection that Cedaw brings to the table, and we can keep analyzing. So let's take a break, and we'll be back at 9 a.m. So take that break right now, and we'll be back in 10 minutes. Thank you. Are you all ready? I see you're coming back. Thank you all. Let's continue with this discussion, reflection around this instrument that we have. And we're going to talk about the general recommendations. In this sense, we're going to talk about the reflection around where it comes from, how it was built, what can we do about it, and propose topics that are still a gap in Cedaw, and for it to serve as an element, an instrument, and it's something that is not just yet represented. So a bit about the purpose of these recommendations. We mentioned this in Article 21, and these recommendations, just general recommendations are created or proposed through the exams that are done periodically, through the reports that are being delivered by each country, and therefore they see what is important and what is relevant. For example, if there's a topic that's meant a lot by different countries, then it's an issue that needs to be talking about that into Cedaw. So those topics are being identified through these reports that are being delivered by each country, um, by the committee, delivered to the committees. Also to share with you that regularly these recommendations are done. These topics are also by the general recommendations are being proposed by the government. Like I was mentioning, they are presented by each country. Even if we present a report, an alternative report, they have taken into account the observation done by the government. From civil society. And this makes to the rights of individual rights, collective rights of indigenous women there, and children and indigenous women, and it's with that exception that has been taken into account. But through this exercise, we can see where we can be proposing from the civil society, from the voices of women, and that this is effective and it can be done. So recommendations are also some make clear certain articles that was just too broad and that it needs to be more broken down and disaggregated. So they can be used for this as well. And also, it can also be approved and built by the committee. No other organization can build and tell us we need to do this recommendation and then here's the document built for you. It can be, it's only the committee that can take into account through their own gatherings of information and what they get from different conversations through different organizations, from civil society, with the government, different entities. Regularly, one of the situations that we see in the general recommendations is that we know that activists get to know and study better the DAO to keep proposing those things that are not present. or that it's not as explicit as it should be. Also, we have, let me see, sorry. According to Article 2 by Cedaw, that talks about the responsibilities that the states need to have to talk about discrimination against women in all its forms, is that we need to broaden it, these recommendations, these general recommendations. And it tells us that within these three powers, well, in Guatemala we have, and I think many other in Latin America, we talk about three branches of the government. Within the governments, right? We have the legislative, the judicial, and the executive. And executive branch. So from these powers, we have make visible this discrimination that is generated towards women. So those recommendations can also be visualized through there. That also talks about how we can generate exist, we can generate new ways of discrimination. We talk about changing societies, and the realities are obviously changing. So in some point, what we understand as part of discrimination can also be adjusted. And therefore the article number 3 talks about this, right? And how we need to be taking measures in this discrimination that can continue to change. Also sharing that to adopt these recommendations, in general recommendations, it is important that a member of the committee of Cedaw can propose that internally for from these 23 people that we mentioned in the past that make up the committee. And this is why it is important that from the organizations of women or civil society, they can find alliances internally from the committee to be able to propose recommendations. For General Law 39, the recommendation number 39 that we're going to be discussing, it is important to find the link with Gladys Acosta, who was the president of the committee. And with her, we were able to create that connection and that alliance that allowed us to propose internally for the Cedaw committee the importance of talking about racism and discrimination, and how they are both topics that are to get together at some point, but also to visualize the rights, the specific rights of Indigenous women within the Cedaw. And it's also that why it was created, the general recommendation number 39. And when this is accepted, then we select within internally in the committee one member that will follow up on this recommendation. And when she does this, she listens to more people about this topic, and then these people will do the research on what's going on in each of the countries, and she will create the general recommendation will allow to see if there's a follow-up that needs to be done. So it's from that, she's in charge of that, overseeing the whole process, gathering theories, gathering cases, listening to the different people from civil society, from organizations about women on the topic. This person will then does a first draft. Regularly, the certain recommendations are approved every 2 years. So this means that This person will dedicate this whole time to listen and gather information. And then we talk to the committee to discuss on this around this topic. And then during the discussion, in many cases, the members of the committee will begin to debate, and in many cases, the recommendations that are proposal will go under will fall because there are members of the committee that says, you know what, that topic for me should be different, talking about differently, or we can name from another vision. We can look at it from another vision, or simply state that it's not necessary to carry out that recommendation, that journal recommendation, and therefore it will be eliminated. So this is why they take a whole year, a whole day to discuss these topics within that process when they get together. And this is the process of how they discuss about and come out with general recommendations. And these general recommendations and proposals is approved. Once it's approved, it goes to the whole plenary. And we talk about the plenary. We talk about all the governments that are who have ratified Cedaw. And then we'll see this. Now we need to broaden Cedaw with this topic. All the states are in charge, yes or no, are in favor, yes or no. They make a whole session to discuss it. Regularly, the ones who are very conservative will create discussions around it and say this is not good. They will make arguments about it and have that discussion. And once it is approved by Cedaw in the country, then automatically the general recommendations are automatically approved and they are linked to the Cedaw. So in the end, we have a bit hard for the states who have approved, and this is negative or positive or negative for their governments, for their states. And this is why it is important this have this topic, these discussions to have this approved. Also, this recommendation again in June, again in 2021, it began as to have this discussion around this recommendation, this general recommendation. Unfortunately, it took about different situations because a bit of what I was mentioning and within the context, right, of how governments do not recognize the indigenous women or how the governments still do not recognize certain cultural practices of the indigenous people and recognize the rights of women, indigenous women, also represents for them a political, for Latin America, for example, we talk a lot about linking with the land. So therefore, companies who are activists cannot be in agreement when we're talking about the land. We're talking about defending the lands, the right of lands. So the governments, and in terms, find this a situation that is very tiring to handle. And this has a discussion because this initiative of this recommendation for the women, it began since 2013 and it was finally approved in 2022, which means that we had almost 10 years of discussion. And it was something that did not fit with the dynamic of the committee, of the Cedaw committee, because like I was mentioning, regularly these recommendations are approved every 2 years. And this was already taking 9 years in the making. So it did represent uh, a challenge, a political challenges in the countries, and it was not the approval of it was not in favor by many countries. And the idea of these discussions is also to give feedback on this that is presented, that is not always present in the discussions, but also it's something positive that can come from it, because sometimes it was left behind, some situations, and something was left outside on how we can strengthen these recommendations. And this is done through these discussions. The members who create the committee are people who represent the whole, the different continents, and that each has a different view or different context or different words that they can use to talk about things that create discrimination, for example. So through these discussions, they can begin to have these discussions about it and debate on what is in these proposals and recommendations.
I want to share that to date, 39 recommendations have been approved, which means that there have been different discussions since 1980 where the Cedaw was approved, all the way to the year 2024, where we've had 39 recommendations approved. Sorry. A lot of these established directions as to how we can continue classifying discrimination, or it states what governments need to do or what states need to do to be able to change these realities. These general recommendations have also been good to speaking about a specific topic. And when you talk about a specific issue, that means that you can take out this topic, and at some point there you'll have an instrument that has 30 extra articles. For example, when we talked about access to justice, that has a specific recommendation on justice. This one has around 36 articles. That means that it deals with 36 points refer to this topic. So we're going to mention some. We're not going to mention all of them here. For example, this one is the general recommendation number 9 that speaks precisely about the statistic data that we were talking about, that the Cedaw saw as very important to discuss these numbers, because it doesn't a specific data that reflects how many Indigenous women we are, or how many Black women exist, or how many, for example, migrant women we have in our countries. There's no data that reflects that. So that general recommendation number 9 talks about that references that it's important to specify the statistical data of the reality of women. We also talked about number 5, that refers to special measures of a temporary character. You can look for it on the internet, all these articles. And for example, these measures, the temporary measures, refer to or states what do we refer to when we talk about this? What are the measures that states can adopt to create these temporary mechanisms? What can be done? For example, in some cases, it makes a reference to general recommendations, or general recommendations make some references to some directives or some ways to link with other United Nations entities. In the case of the general recommendation number 15, that talks about women and AIDS, for example, and how AIDS continues to affect mainly women, but also how they can link to other entities of the United Nations that specifically talk about this topic. Maybe the Cedaw has not specialized on this topic, the topic of AIDS, but there is another internal mechanism within the United Nations that has the mandate to work this situation, to work this issue. Here in number 12, which is also very important, and I'm going to tell you why. Well, in the Cedaw, we talk about discrimination, right? In the different steps or different phases of women's life, but they don't speak about violence. Even though discrimination can generate violence, but in the entire content of the Cedaw, violence isn't named. And that was like a debt that the towards women, because violence itself was something that is constantly lived by women in its different manifestations, physical, psychological, patrimonial, and it wasn't discussed specifically. And that was something that was a debt to women. And hence that recommendation number 12 has been one of the most relevant that we have had, precisely because we can now discuss or name through the Cedaw, we can now establish or read the violence that women live or experience in their life, and that it's necessary, it brings light to the fact that it's necessary to broaden the definition of violence to those different instances that women live, especially when we talk about violence. How can we bring that to our countries? What type of violence women are living? And that is important. If you can look for it, if you can maybe give us some feedback based on these recommendations, based on what's going on in your country, that would be very interesting if you could do that and give us feedback so that we all know what's going on in your region. We're also going to continue talking about this recommendation number 12, and that here in the recommendation 19, it talks to us again about violence against women. And you may wonder, why are there two general recommendations that talk to us about violence against women? And the reason is that these recommendations can be broadened. One same topic can be broadened and can be talked about in other general recommendations, or you can give it another point of view to that existing recommendation, and that is not limited by Cedaw. And that's another aspect that enriches these recommendations, or that these recommendations can enrich, because probably the violence that was experienced by women in 1989 is not the same kind of violence that are living women in 1980, that women were experiencing in 1982. Or what has been done in some instances is that these general recommendations talk about a specific topic, but at the same time, they can leave other aspects of this same topic out of the picture and not taken into consideration. And hence women say, well, it's necessary to broaden, to include or make this recommendation more complete, because this is not representative to us, because we need to highlight these aspects, because that's the only way we can legislate, that's the only way we can use this convention to defend our rights. And then that's why a general recommendation that has already been established can be completed or can be broadened. We also have as another example, what is the political and public life of women, which is also being broadened, it's also being enriched. We have temporary measures, and those have also been completed and have been enriched. Then we have recommendation number 26, which talks about migrant working women. And here it's important to pay attention to that. And it's that women that work in other countries, like immigrants, they suffer very strong levels of discrimination. For us, a clear example and the closest thing that we can live is in the case of United States, where most of the population immigrates or migrates to in Latin America. And I think that also in your countries, there are other countries that are model countries that are like United States, or you have people who go to United States and they live discrimination, and immigrant women live discrimination in a very specific way. And this was also brought in the Cedaw. Right now, the committee of the Cedaw is working to release a general recommendation that specifies also the rights that women need to have, immigrant women need to have, whether it's in the transit or women when they are already living in a territory that is not their own. And that is being worked on by the Cedaw, and they're taking as a basis these recommendations, or this recommendation number 26, that talks to us directly about immigrant working women. So these are sort of the different issues that we are referring to, that we need to refer to, and that we need to consider. And something else that has really drawn everybody's attention in regards to women, and that in several occasions has also been left behind, or that very few times is being analyzed, is that discrimination that older women live, and that they need their rights to be protected. And I consider that very, very few organizations make this public, everything that's going on with older women. What's happening with them? Are there mechanisms to protect their rights? Are there mechanisms where they can still protect their rights, or do they see them as where they can see them from a perspective of discrimination, or do they try to protect their rights? In our territories, for example, in Guatemala, there's a program of the older adults, and they kind of help them financially. The older population, they help them financially, but there isn't really a specific program for older women or elderly women. You can see there that there is a clear example of how discrimination is happening because of the results. Probably the objective, it's not for the program, isn't that one, but instead it's just to provide some financial support. But at the same time, we don't see that there's a specific program for women, for elderly women. And so this is something of what we have to date of these general recommendations. There is a recommendation that talks to us, well, number 35. Oh, I don't know what happened with my PowerPoint. But the general recommendation number 35, which talks to us about rural women. This general recommendation was adopted in the year 2015. And they were mentioning that it was so necessary to be able to emphasize the access that rural women need to have, but also within that same time, we were promoting the inclusion of recommendation number 39, which talks to us about women, children and women, Indigenous women and girls, sorry. But why do we need another recommendation for Indigenous women if we already have the recommendation for rural women? And it was a whole debate, and that also kind of delayed all this until 1992. This general recommendation was approved. And we said, well, not all rural women are Indigenous. And it's not just that we are discriminating women who live in the rural areas, but we have to strengthen this and strengthen it with something more explicit for Indigenous women. So that was a very strong debate, even internally in the committee, because they no longer wanted to release a similar recommendation. However, this finally happened, and something important is that for the first time, they spoke about Indigenous girls. That means that for the first time, we are talking about a sector of women that don't still to date have that voice, that are Indigenous girls, such as Indigenous girls. And they also shared why we were including Indigenous girls if there was a mechanism that speaks directly about children. That in this case is the Children's Convention. And that they said, well, why don't they go to that committee to have them talk about the rights of Indigenous girls? However, that was a very important discussion that we had, to be able to propose that recommendations should also discuss women and the Indigenous women and girls. I would like to ask you if you have any doubts on these recommendations that we are studying at this time. Is there anything that is unclear? No? Okay. Likewise, this presentation is going to be on Moodle. You can then see it calmly, read it calmly, and also research what are all these recommendations about, because if we start talking about all the recommendations, we're never going to finish this session. And I invite you to read each one of these general recommendations that are wonderful for me, because they definitely resolve a little bit of that void that the Cedaw has, and that can also serve to help us and serve as a platform for us to be able to broaden what exists already, and also even deal with new topics, and that's not impossible. It can really be done, and that I consider that it's an alternative that women can have, and that we can, while we can really make these treaties relevant to our realities, then we need to use these recommendations so that we can make this way more applicable to our realities. Now we're going to talk specifically about recommendation 39, which speaks about Indigenous women and girls. And that is something that this course is also requested, this space that we are in, that we can talk about directly about this recommendation. It's been a request.
well, what we had said that the states that have ratified these recommendations need to comply with mitigating discrimination and be able to be accountable about this. And when we talk about General Recommendation 39, we're obligating the states, the party states, so that they can provide provide information about how Indigenous women and girls' rights are being protected. That's the main objective, because regularly we have very general reports. However, they don't speak specifically of Indigenous women. And it was this objective that we had to address, this general recommendation. That was like the first aspect. The second is that this general recommendation number 39, its objective is that also Indigenous women have, or that Indigenous women also have a tool that will allow them to guarantee their rights. And when we talk about a tool, we mean that within this recommendation 39, there's also 30 other articles that talk to us about those rights. And that's very important to consider, because aside from the other 39 recommendations, this general recommendation number 39 was built from civil society, but also it refers or came from that need to have different encounters from each of the continents. And it was something that had never been worked on internally in the Cedaw. And we were able to have these encounters, called at some point consultations, to be able to hear the voices of Indigenous women, because they represented a whole challenge for the committee, because our way of thinking, our way of being was completely different. And hence, to respond to those needs, we needed to have these conversations with women. We needed to have women really empower themselves and make this content theirs. And something that was happening was directly related to these different public consults we're doing during COVID. And for some continents, these consultations were done virtually. I don't know if any of you had the opportunity to participate. Maybe that could also be a homework, to be able to look if your country was able to participate or not, where they have Indigenous population in these consultations. A little bit to know about this recent history, because it was something like 2-3 years ago that they were talking about this general recommendation. And in difference to Latin America, or that was already dealing with COVID in that same year, in the year 2022, they did a big meeting in Mexico to be able to talk about this content of the recommendation number 39. We also feel that this recommendation 39 is pretty important, precisely because it builds this tool. It becomes this tool for many organizations to be able to make visible the discrimination that Indigenous women live. Also, how it can be a tool for monitoring for organizations as to how these rights are being organized internally in the countries, and how you can render some sort of accountability when you present the reports, but also how the content of this recommendation 39 speaks about how governments can do their job, but also talks about how women can continue strengthening our rights from our own vision. And that at some point, we are going to need that our rights are respected, but how we can continue recreating and strengthening these existing rights. And that this refers to a fight that is never ending of women, a never ending fight of women. And the only thing that we're trying to do is to expose this. For example, the defense of territory, which is a topic that is referred to in this general recommendation. And what it does is that it, for example, states, places in evidence that this is a right for Indigenous women, or it talks about how we're linked to water and how we see the energy of water, how we live it, that it's not just something that's going to serve for another hydroelectrical company, but that it also serves a purpose for us as part of our livelihood and our vitality. And this is also discussed in recommendation 39. So what it does is it says, hey state, hey government, do not create violence of these rights that are mine. So what it does is what it does. And we could also say that these recommendation 39 also comes to watch everything that has already been achieved with the rights of women, but it also is going to be watchful of the Indigenous rights of women and girls. Share with you the structure that the general recommendation 39 has, that you also have that in the platform and you can read it. And that refers to that at some point, it talks to us that it describes the aspects where the women's rights have been violated, a little bit of the context of what this women are living. And it also talks to us about what is that objective that general recommendation 39 chases or is aiming for, which is divided in two separate areas, which is the rights, which also talks to us about the right of women, but it also talks about the obligations that party states have. Moving forward within this content, we see the part number four that talks about the participation of party states, and it's a little bit more detailed. It's more specific in order to eradicate that discrimination against women. In numeral 5, it talks to us about these obligations regarding to more specific situation, and it talks to us about the rights. What are those rights that we need to generate evidence for Indigenous women? And all these recommendations we can analyze based on the articles of the Cedaw. A lot of these are built based on articles number 5, and there are other rights, for example, new rights that we are discussing that are for Indigenous women. We cannot hear the presenter because her internet signal is not very good, so we cannot translate. Something there in this recommendation, we make emphasis on the okay, so it talks about Indigenous women's rights. For example, the transfer of Indigenous or historical or ancestral knowledge. And that, for example, Convention 169 doesn't talk about this transfer of knowledge that women do. So this general's recommendation talks about that. Some examples of what this general recommendation talks about. For example, they talked to us about the right to education, how women see the right to education, of our language, of that quality that we need, and our education from our own way of being. It also talks to us about the right to work, where women can have the same working opportunities, and that has to do, or is also very discussed in the dialogues that we had, because usually women are seen within that private space. So women have been seen as within the slavery, and we can access to the right kind of or the right kind of jobs, but instead we're seen as slaves. And that states that has also given way to the fact that we don't have the same rights. And that's also talked about in the recommendation number 39. We also talk about the right to health. And I was telling you that in this general recommendation, number 24, as you can see, we have 39. Number 24 also talks about the health of women, but it also, in recommendation 39, we make that emphasis of how we see that health. We have different kinds of healers we have different kinds of people who take care to tend to women. We have shamans, we have women who create a balance in our energy. And that was something that was very clear, or left very clear, in recommendation 39, that those are also Indigenous women's help, and or Indigenous women's transfer of knowledge to general population. The right to culture, something very important that has been spoken about in this recommendation, is that we talk about the right to earth, to property, without talking about the right to women. We also talk about the right to property, to territory. We talk about water, about seeds, to have the right to have a clean, sustainable environment. And that we can see it from a different perspective, that's different, that's far away from the concepts that currently this modern time offers us, this globalized world offers us, but that instead, from our own vision. What do we refer to when we talk about sustainability? Article 1 and 2 talks to us directly about, we need to guarantee that compliance, because in a lot of instances we have these recommendations that talk to us about right, but they don't tell us how we need to make them be complied with, or how we're going to enforce them. And we have to make sure that we know that in this recommendation number 39, we're going to work on making them compliant. And another important aspect is that here we bring to place the intersectional discrimination. And when we talk about this kind of intersectional discrimination, we refer to women. We took into consideration the discrimination of Indigenous women that are part of the trans community. Something that is not directly discussed in the Cedaw, but that in our case, we brought it forth, and the fact is that it's not the same discrimination that trans women live with compared to other kind of ethnical women in comparison to the Indigenous trans women. Or we also talked about women who live with any kind of disability. And we talked about Indigenous women are even more discriminated when they are Indigenous and they have a disability of any kind, visual, intellectual, of any kind. That discrimination is even heavier for them. Or we also talked about that intersectional discrimination, mainly for women who, depending on their age range, there's also a discrimination. Discrimination has a different impact. For example, for girls, at some point, discrimination can be directly done, really happening when they don't have access to education, or they're imposed other cultures that are not theirs. Or, for example, when we see Indigenous women, adult Indigenous women that are elderly, we see that discrimination can have a completely different effect in them. So it's a little bit of that this deals with, this recommendation. Recommendation number 39. And this recommendation was built from a perspective of gender, taking into consideration these practices that generate stereotypes, prejudice, and that we know that a lot of these stereotypes and prejudice and practices that are discriminatory have had a historical tint, have been colonized, have been from the colonization eras, where they are trying to homogenize all for the population and leave aside all the differences. And this that is historical and that is continuous, it's affecting women, and it was important to add it and create evidence of how Indigenous women are living this, because it's not the same when we talk about gender perspectives for other cultures or other ways of identification that is different from us. What we have been talking about in regards to that intersectional perspective, and that also refers to a structure that has been built from a anthropocentrical vision, a vision that leaves to the side these characteristics or differentiated characteristics. Also here, we had the emphasis of how states that these magnitudes that are generated by discrimination that are seen from the lens of intersectionality. Another perspective that we took into consideration from this general recommendation is that we can understand that situation that Indigenous women live, that we have necessities and different needs and different realities that they live, and hence it's important to put that into evidence, but also how that difference for Indigenous men exists. Something that probably is in the Convention 169 that talks about an entire society. Here we talk specifically about women and Indigenous women and girls, and how at some point the conditions of Indigenous women are different based on the same gender or that they identify in. So hence these realities are completely different. they also built this recommendation, general recommendation from an intercultural perspective, which means that we tried, and I say we tried because we are completely different, Indigenous women, take into consideration the diversity of what we are, of who we are, including language, beliefs, social values that we have. I'm sure that a lot of this perspective, intercultural perspective, was left out. I consider that we couldn't have all the different visions of Indigenous women of the world, because it's very important to reach all the consensus. It's also very difficult to respond to all the needs. We try to give it a perspective, but we can also here take that tool of how we can maybe expand this recommendation number 39, taking into consideration these characteristics. We also built from a multidisciplinary perspective, precisely because discrimination is multifaceted for women and Indigenous women and girls, and that it was necessary to take into consideration the experiences of women, the ones that they have had, the experiences that Indigenous women have had in education and culture and spirituality, which is something that is wonderful, we were able to leave in this general recommendation. How Indigenous women live that spirituality. We also try to add that experience of Indigenous women in economy and science, how women have provided a lot of knowledge, and how we can broaden that vision from the states so that they can promote actions that allow us to recognize women and what has been their contributions from these spaces, with the idea of not generating this existing discrimination. Something else that is spoken about in the regards to this recommendation in comparison to the 38 that already exists is that we talk about an individual dimension, but we also talk about a collective vision. And this is something in particular that is dealt with in recommendation 39, because usually Indigenous women are also looked at from the collective. We don't look at each other from the individual aspect. And that was also something that we were able to establish in this recommendation. And that also, we also have other treaties where they have been trying to incorporate this, however, not from the vision of the Indigenous women. So this is definitely very important that it has been left on that, on this recommendation, because the rights for us have always been seen from this perspective, this collective perspective, and that we feel that when we do something in the collective, we are thinking not only of us and only thinking from those visions that they have wanted to impose on us, but also that we have tried to rescue throughout history because of the different facts and situations that we have been victims of and survivors of that. And this is something that we've wanted to rescue with this way of life. What I was mentioning on this dimension, collective dimension that Indigenous communities have. And so we are going to finish. Unfortunately, time goes by too quickly, and we are going to continue with these mentioning this general recommendation a little bit more in the next session that we're going to have. And I am so excited and so happy that we were able to meet today. And today we talked about these general recommendations, so that what they're for, how do we do them, how can we use them as a different tool to defend our rights. We were able to really look into depth on recommendation 39 that talks about the rights of Indigenous women and girls, and that is something that we have worked with in the groups. We have been talking about that the Cedaw doesn't really talk about Indigenous women or Black women, but here there is a proposal from our vision, and that is broadening. Cedaw is enriched from this. I'm sure that there's a lot more pending on this recommendation, and that probably from here we can get our own conclusions and our own ways of how we can continue applying the Cedaw. And that's what we have seen today or studied today. Please try to look at the documents that we have in the Moodle platform, so that you can also get some feedback of these knowledge and sort of enrich this knowledge. We have left some theories, some documents that are backups and that are able to enrich your experience. And we will meet next Tuesday. Next Tuesday, I would ask you to please read recommendation 39 a little bit, so that we have some elements, because we are going to work on an analysis that is deeper about this, what we can use, but also what are those voids that we still have on recommendation 39. So if you could please download it, maybe read it, and then that day we are going to be discussing it on Tuesday. Is there any? There are some messages in the chat. I'm going to try to read them, and we'll discuss. So we're going to read the messages that you guys have placed in English, in Spanish. Give me 1 second. I've just read all your comments in the Spanish channel. So Sarah was saying, yes, everything that has to do with mental health, spirituality, those ways of resilience of women, Indigenous women, we don't have a recommendation based off of that, but it would be very interesting to be able to do it or propose it, because we have our own ways of healing, or even creating the balance of our energies, which is what we call our mental health, that balance of our energies. And how exciting that this could come out of this beautiful group. So thank you for your attention. We're going to see each other next Tuesday. I appreciate the comments that you add in the chat. And if you can check the platform so that we can continue providing feedback on everything that we're studying, it's going to be very useful. So we'll see each other next Tuesday.